All right, welcome back to Melanated Truth. My name is John. We are in yet another Torah talk. This time we are talking through Genesis chapter 6. Really excited to do this, but there's a lot. This chapter of the Bible has a lot of implications for the rest of the Old Testament, but not just the rest of the Old Testament, the rest of the Bible. And when Yahusha comes on the scene, who many know as Jesus Christ, when Yahusha comes on the scene, there are things that he does and things that he says, locations that he goes to, that don't make a whole lot of sense if we don't get a good grasp on what is happening here in Genesis chapter 6. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take Genesis 6 in two parts. We're going to handle specifically, or this narrative, which we'll call the fall of the Watchers. The fall of the Watchers we're going to take in two parts. We're going to zoom in specifically on Genesis chapter 6. We'll handle that right now. And then in the next couple of days, I'll upload another one and we'll overview the apocryphal book, the book of Enoch, which, by the way, and we'll deal with this when we get there, but the book of Enoch is seen to be canonical in the Ethiopian church. And many see it as scripture elsewhere. And yeah, we'll get to that when we get to the book of Enoch. But these are two corroborating stories that help us understand what's going on here, and maybe the motivation for why this is placed in this place as we go forward. But before we actually look at Genesis chapter 6, let's just be reminded of some things that are happening so far in the Torah. Remember, we said Torah means law or God's instruction. And so far in the instruction that the Most High has given his people, there's not a lot of what you might call didactic laws as much as it is a whole bunch of stories. And specifically in Genesis 1 through 12, these stories are written in bullet points. You're getting the highlights of a lot of these stories. And when we compare Genesis chapter 6 to Enoch, the first 15 or 20 chapters of Enoch, you understand that Genesis is a far more condensed version of the exact same events. And most likely it's because the people of the day would have known these things. The author, he's highlighting certain bullet points to make a point, but he's assuming that the audience knows this story to some degree. So if we're ignorant to the things that are going on, understand that it's we that are ignorant and not the original audience. So we'll get there. But as you can remember, so far there's been we've seen creation, we've seen what we call the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3, where Nahash, the serpent, tricks the man and the woman to eating the fruit, and they fall, they're kicked out of Eden. And then they have these sons, and one of the sons is a murderer, and he murders his brother. And now he's not only kicked out of, I'm sorry, the man and the woman, Adam and Isha or Eve, they're kicked out of the garden. And then they have two sons. One of the sons is a murderer. He gets kicked out of Eden as a whole. He builds the city. Then the Bible traces these two lineages. And in Genesis 3, we learn that there's going to be this enmity. The storyline of the Bible is that there's going to be enmity between the serpent, Nahash, and his seed, and the seed of the woman, the line of humanity. There's going to be enmity between these two groups. And then in chapter 4 and chapter 5 corroborates that. Chapter 4, we trace the seed of the serpent, who is Cain, the murderer, who mimics the serpent and becomes beastly. He becomes like a beast, and he goes and builds this kingdom, this city. He's the first one to build a city. These are the whispers of what a beast kingdom will eventually become, and there's several beast kingdoms in the Bible. And we'll get to all that, but all these things are being fainted just in these first few chapters. Chapter 5 is this really long genealogy, and we took a lot of time to walk through Genesis chapter 5 because the whole point of Genesis chapter 5, and really everything in Genesis up to this point, is the struggle of who is supposed to rule and who is supposed to reign, who are the rightful leaders of this terrain. And Genesis chapter 5 was in conversation with Genesis chapter 4, the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman, specifically Seth's line. But also we said that Genesis chapter 5 was in conversation with what's called the Sumerian Kings list, which is this ancient document older than the Bible, in which the ancient kings in Mesopotamia trace their lineage all the way back to what they would call the Anunnaki, or the gods of old. And they proclaimed that they had a divine right to rule their various areas because they had a direct bloodline connection and genealogical receipts and records that linked them all the way back. The Bible then responds in Genesis chapter 5, and the Bible shows it begins to trace a line that goes all the way back to Adam, whom the Most High Yah, the one true Elohim, the one true God, he gave Adam the divine right to rule. And this particular family is tracing its lineage back to its legitimate ownership, or its legitimate leadership. So all of this whole struggle is a struggle for who's supposed to rule, who's supposed to lead in this terrain that the Most High has created. Now, this narrative continues, and in fact, the plot begins to thicken. So Genesis chapter 6 might sound strange, and it may not, if you grew up in Sunday school, going to church, and those kind of things. This might not be the way these things were taught, but I think we're on really sound footing with what we're about to say. And if the conversation that we have today doesn't prove that, then I hope that the conversation, the next one, as we examine it against the text of Enoch, it'll begin to make a whole lot more sense. So all that being said, let's actually dive into Genesis chapter 6, the fall of the Watchers. We're going to take this thing in three parts. We're going to look at the fall of the Watchers. Then we're going to look at the spread of mankind's sin, and then the consequences of those actions. This is what Genesis 6 is dealing with. So let's look at it. Genesis 6, starting in verse 1. And I made hopefully for you listening on YouTube or you viewing on YouTube, these words being bigger actually help. So you know, let me know in the comments if this is actually helpful, making the font as big as it is. Okay, Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 1. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, that is the Hebrew phrase, Beni Elohim, the sons of God, saw that the daughters of man, sons of God, Beni Elohim, daughters of man, Adam, right, were attractive. Now, this word attractive is tov. Tov, which in Hebrew just means good. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were good, and they took as their wives any that they chose. Then Yahuwah said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. Let's stop there just for a second, and I want to go back to our PowerPoint. Now, this is what we can call the three rebellions. Many of us are taught about the rebellion that happens in the garden, but in Genesis 1 through 11, there's actually three rebellions that happen. In other words, as the author of Genesis is trying to explain why we need the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and ultimately the seed of Abraham, according to Galatians, who is Yahusha himself, not seeds, but seed. The reason we need Yahusha to come in the flesh is because of not only what happens in Genesis 3 in the garden, but also what happens in Genesis 6 and what happens in Genesis 11. So let's look at the three rebellions comparatively. And I hope you'll see that the Bible is intending to make these connections, these scenes, what happens in these rebellions intentionally rhyme. This is a rhyme scheme. It's I've often compared the Bible. I think the Bible most compares to a music. It compares to jazz music, where there are these rhythms and these schemes that get laid out and patterns that get played with. So here's the pattern of Genesis 3. As the woman fell, the woman saw that the tree was tov. The tree was good for food, and she took. That is the fall of man. This is what happens. The serpent tempts her. She saw that the tree was good, and she took. And this is the fall of man. Then she handed it to her husband, and he ate, and they discovered that they were naked, and they were in this big mess, and they ended up getting kicked out of the garden. And this kicks off the serpent's first chess move in trying to usurp authority from Adam, because ultimately the serpent is jealous and he wants to be the ruler of this world, right? So that's Genesis 3. Ultimately, we know, if you haven't watched our Genesis 3 conversation, go back and watch it. But the serpent intends to curse the man and the woman and to exalt himself, and essentially to usurp authority over the man and the woman. But the exact opposite happens. The serpent is cursed. He gets thrown down to the ground, and now he has to crawl on the ground and eat dust. And the man and the woman are not cursed. Instead, they're dealing with the implications of the cursed serpent and the cursed ground. So now they have to deal with the consequences of the cursed woman. I'm sorry, the cursed ground and the cursed serpent. So that's Genesis 3. The woman saw that the tree was good, and she took. Genesis 6, we see the exact same pattern. The Beni Elohim, that is the watchers or the angels, and we'll see that more clearly when we get to the book of Enoch. The Beni Elohim, the sons of God, saw that the daughters of man, that is human women, so angels see that human women were attractive, and we just saw that that word was good. So it's literally the same exact pattern. The woman saw that the tree was good, and she took. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were good, and they took. So this is a rebellion equal to the rebellion that happened in the garden. In Genesis 3, we get the fall of man. Genesis 6, we get the fall of these angels, or what is called the watchers. Okay, Genesis 6, starting in verse, and we'll get to the third rebellion when we get there. It's Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were good or attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then Yahuwah said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These children, these Nephilim, were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. So let's just pause there just for a second. And these are the claims that the Bible is making here. Who are the Nephilim? Who are the Nephilim? There's a lot of discussion on who the Nephilim are, and I'm going to save some of that for our next conversation, because Enoch maps it out even more. But the fact that they're called Nephilim is really important. The Nephilim, the Hebrew word Nephilim, right? Nephilim. It's a combination. Well, the we've talked about this before, but the the eem ending is just plural. So what does Nephel mean? And the verb Nephel means to fall. So the Nephilim are the fallen ones. These are called the fallen ones. Okay, so the sons of God see the daughters of men. They go into them. They take them as their wives. They bear children to them, and they're called the fallen ones, or the Nephilim. And these fallen ones, these hybrid angel men, these were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Now, this probably sounds fanatical to many of us, especially if you've never heard something like this before. But it's important to note that all, with almost no exception, all ancient cultures, the leaders of said ancient cultures claimed either the monarchy or the pharaohship or the reason they were czars or whatever, the kingship of their particular culture, country, nation. They claimed to be, they claimed a divine right. In other words, they were descended from the gods. So what we saw in the Genesis 5 conversation is not unique. The Anunnaki and the Sumerian kings list, and having a condensed record of how your lineage traces all the way back to the gods, that was not abnormal, especially in those days. It's actually relatively abnormal. Or let me say it this way: Western cultures are relatively unique in that our leaders don't come out and say that they believe that they are descendants from these Nephilim, these fallen ones, these hybrid creatures. Although there are, to this day, there are people and bloodlines who claim these very things. The reason why they're in certain positions of power, and you can go look it up. There's a bunch of names that you probably already know, and they claim that they were the offspring of these people. And not just that, but if you've heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh was said to be one of these. That's the Babylonian narrative. The reason he was able to be king is because he's said to be the product of a god, an Elohim, and a human mom. And then you've got the mythological accounts of the likes of Hercules, who Hercules is said to be the son of Zeus and a human mother. You've got the Roman narrative. There's the Romans, when they ruled, their aristocracy, their leadership class, they claim to be a direct bloodline descendant of Athena and a man that Athena slept with, and this is why they had the divine right to be in the positions that they were in. And that idea, though more subvert, continues to this very day. And I'll just leave it at that. You can go on Rumble and type in 13 bloodline families and figure out what's going on there. But these, as conspiracy theory and as strange as these concepts might be to us, they do have root in the scriptures. They do have root in these texts. And that's just helpful to note that the Bible, that as the world begins to wake up to how strange reality is, it's not catching the Bible off guard. In fact, this has been here this whole time. We just didn't know it. Okay, let me move forward. I'm gonna read it one more time. When man, that is Adam, humans, began to multiply on the face of the land, daughters were born to them. The sons of God, angels, watchers is what Enoch calls them, or the sons of heaven is what Enoch calls them, saw that the daughters were attractive or were good, and they took as their wives any as they choose. Then Yahuwah said, my spirit shall not abide in Adam, or man, forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God, he's repeating it just in case you thought he was stuttering, the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. This word here for renown, we've gone over it over and over again, but it's an important word. It's the word Shem. It's the same word for name, but it can mean name or reputation. So these are the men of Shem, the men of reputation. This is going to come into play because in Genesis 11, what happens is there is a collaborated effort between humans and these fallen ones to build a tower. And the human motivation is they want to make a Shem. They want to make a name for themselves. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but this is where that is going. So again, these fallen ones, these are the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Now these are also in Greek this gets translated to gigantos, which is the giants, and so we get into a whole lot of mythological things. Now, just a quick word on the word mythology. The word mythology is a relatively new word in the grand scheme of existence. I believe it first comes into fruition in the mid 17th century, and it was basically a way. So what I'm trying to say is essentially this: these things that we call mythology, about dragons and about giants and about angels and about Zeus having sex with a woman and having Hercules, or about the Babylonian god having sex with a woman and having Gilgamesh. These things to us, we get to put in this pretty box called mythology, but in these various cultures, they were not mythology. It would have been known as their history. This would have been the history of these places. And again, like I said, most of the time, it would have been the official history of the monarchy, and thus the reason why the ruling class was in the chairs that they were in, because they were the descendants of these ones, right? These mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. They claimed direct descension from them. Hopefully that makes sense. Verse 5. Then Yahuwah saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of his thoughts, of the thoughts of his heart, was evil continually. Okay, so if this is true, so one of the big pushbacks on the idea that this is actually angels and women, other than it's just kind of bizarre, especially for the modern mind, the post Enlightenment mind, which the Enlightenment happened in the 15th century, and basically what historians today call the Dark Ages. First of all, it was dark. It was the Dark Ages for a whole bunch of different reasons. It was a whole bunch of black people, the Moors and others, that were leading Europe, and that was called the quote unquote Dark Ages. Now, the Age of Enlightenment, 1500s and forward, it's basically called the Age of Reason, where called the Age of Reason because people stopped believing in dragons and mythology and the gods and all these things, and we started focusing on the scientific method. It's the age of science and reason and those kinds of things. And it's a lot of where the history of the world begins to get directed into this far more secular direction. And that's not even to equate it as good or bad, but this is just the reality. Then in the 1700s, this idea of mythology is created, and before the 1500s, all of these different cultures all over the world, from the Aztecs to the Babylonians, to the Egyptians, the Grecians, the Greeks, and the Romans, all of them in separate places had this in their history, that the reason the leaders were the leaders is because they were descendants of the gods. They were humans, but they were also partially divine by way of the descension of their particular gods that ruled over them. Okay. Now, one of the big pushbacks on this is the idea of what happens in verse 5. God saw that the wickedness of man was great. So why is God, if it's the watchers, if it's the angels that are falling, why is it that God sees the wickedness of man and how messed up man has become, and there's all these consequences that come from it? Again, it's helpful to have the book of Enoch side by side with this, because what the book of Enoch tells us is that these fallen angels, these men of renown, as they were taking women for themselves, they were creating societies, and they were teaching them things, and in teaching them these things, instead of leading humanity on the path of righteousness, it led humanity on the path of wickedness. And the more that the fallen angels taught them, the more destructive humanity got towards themselves, and the more and the further away from the Most High that they go. So what Genesis 6 is telling us is it's telling us about the fall of the Watchers and the human consequences of what has happened from the fall of the Watchers. And what are the human consequences? Man's wickedness multiplies, and God's heart is grieved. Verse 6. And Yahuwah regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Grief is a really interesting idea, because when you are apathetic towards someone, you cannot be grieved by them. It's only when there's a deep love that someone can be grieved. So whatever's happened with this fall of the Watchers, with the Nephilim coming into existence, with the multiplying of wickedness on the earth, and in the subsequent consequences of those things, um, 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 sorry, I lost my train of thought. The subsequent consequences of these things cause God's heart to be grieved, mainly because he loves his creation. He didn't mistakenly put man as the leaders of this whole thing. He created this world so that man could enjoy it, could lead over it, rule over it, have a relationship with him, have a relationship with one another. And the Watchers, not staying in their place and doing these dastardly deeds, it's breaking the whole created order. And that's the whole point. The whole point is the whole created order is being broken, and it grieves the heart of God. Verse 7. So Yahuwah said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things, birds of heaven, for I am sorry that I have made them. So just notice, I will blot out man, who's supposed to be the leader over creation, from the face of the land, man, animals, creeping things, the birds of heaven. So he's walking through the tier. It's the exact copy of the Genesis 1 language when the Most High sets up the structure of who's supposed to lead, rule, reign, etc. It is man made in the image of the Most High, and then the beast of the land, the birds of the heavens, etc. He's repeating that thing. He's saying essentially what he's saying is, I am going to have to completely undo the created order. I'm about to completely wipe the slate clean and do a essentially a reset. Verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahuwah. But Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahuwah. Verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with Elohim, walked with God. And Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Why would they put a genealogy and just a little snippet of a genealogy in the middle of this story? Remember, chapter 4, genealogy of the seed of the serpent. Chapter 5, a genealogy of Adam through Seth's line, and now we're tracing the righteous line, or the chosen line, the anointed line, right? The seed of the woman, essentially, from Genesis chapter 3. Now we get to Genesis chapter 6, and it starts talking about the sons of God, the daughters of man, all these kind of things, all these consequences that are coming down the pike. And right in between it, he puts this little genealogy. The point is simply this: the author is trying to help us understand that we haven't left the Genesis 4 and 5 conversation. That what's happening in Genesis 6 is a continuation of what's going on in Genesis chapter 5. He wants to let us know, boom, just in case you thought we lost it, this is the same genealogy. In other words, Genesis 5's genealogy connects to Genesis 6, verse 9, and then eventually it's going to pick up later on in Genesis chapter 11. This is one genealogy with a couple of stories in between to help us explain what's happening in all of these stories, right? Hopefully that makes sense. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt. The earth was corrupt in God's sight. Let me go back up here real quick. Yahuwah saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of his hearts was only evil continually. Now, remember in the garden, so the Bible is a meta narrative, which means it constantly is referencing itself. And just like you have to tune your ears to appreciate jazz music, or to appreciate rap music, or to appreciate any kind of highly complex musical idea that's equipped with many various kind of motifs, you've got to tune your ear to it. If you don't have an appreciation for jazz and you just flip on some really complicated Miles Davis or something, it's going to sound like noise mostly. But if you understand how jazz music works, when you click on Miles Davis, then you hear, oh, there's limitless amounts of beauty and intricacy and intention in these notes. Same thing is happening here in the Bible. Over and over and over again, especially Genesis 1 through 3, the Bible is going to continue to riff on these patterns, to go back and to reference itself and to continue to loop on these patterns. It's not unlike really good rap music when an artist is able to reference things in the culture, things from other rappers, things that they project in the future, and wrap all those things up in a story and make it rhyme. And it's extremely complicated, and it sounds like noise if you don't know how to appreciate it. Okay, now let me go back. So what happens in Genesis chapter 3? Well, there's a decision, and the decision that Adam and Isha have to make is: are they going to eat from the tree of life? Are they going to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? That is Tov and Ra. That is good and bad. The knowledge of the tree of good and bad. And what happens? The woman saw that the tree is good, and she eats from the tree of good and bad, right? So then what happens with Genesis 6? The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were good, and they took. It's the same pattern of a fall. We've covered that. Verse 5, what is Yahuwah's perspective on all of this? Yahuwah saw that the wickedness of man was great. That's the same word from the derivative of ra, right? So, in other words, let me say it this way. Adam and Eve saw that the fruit was good and they took it. It was rebellion. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, so they took them. It's rebellion. But from the heavenly perspective, the Most High sees that it's bad and that the badness or the wickedness of man has now multiplied and grown and has to be dealt with, right? Let's go back down. Now the earth was corrupt in the earth was corrupt in God's sight. So now again, he sees, and what does he see? Instead of seeing tov, he sees ra, which is a different word from that, but it's the same concept. Instead of uh instead of seeing tov, he sees ra, and that the earth is filled instead of with good, instead of with shalom, which we see at the end of Genesis 1, beginning of Genesis 2, that the earth was filled with shalom at his created order. Now what we see is violence and chaos. We see a reintroduction of Genesis 1, 2, tohu wa vohu, formless and void, wild wilderness, corruption, destruction, watery chaos is what we see. And it gets introduced, it gets furthered by the fall of these watchers. Verse 12, and God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And Elohim said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. So we get the fall of the watchers. We get the consequences of the watchers falling, namely that they influenced man to further corruption. So here's the question that we've got to answer: if the Nephilim or the offspring of the Nephilim lead the world, what will happen to the world? It's going to descend into utter chaos, strife, violence, immorality, all sorts of mixing that shouldn't happen, also diving into all sorts of forbidden knowledge, which we'll get into that with Enoch. So the leadership of the Watchers is illegitimate leadership, and a part of the proof of that is the product. When Yahusha comes on the scene, he says, wisdom is justified by her children. What happens when the Nephilim come on the scene? They take daughters for themselves. The men of renown come on the scene, and because of their great stature and because of their great knowledge, they lead the world. What happens? It grieves the heart of God. Violence and wickedness multiplies on the earth, and ultimately the world's got to be destroyed because of it. In other words, it's utter illegitimate leadership. The Proverbs say, when the wicked rule, the people groan, but when the righteous rule, there's great celebration, there's joy, right? So a proof, again, just to be clear, all of this is about the divine right to rule. Who has the right to lead? Who has the right to rule? And what Genesis is saying is we've seen what happened when the Watchers take over, the fallen Watchers take over, the sons of God, when they rebel and they lead, it everything gets messed up. Violence increases, everything gets destroyed. What's supposed to bring life and shalom and joy actually brings destruction and chaos. Instead of going further into beauty and shalom, we get degenerate into tohu wa vohu, formless and void. We go backwards instead of going forwards. Okay, so I don't want to touch on on Noah's Ark quite yet because we'll give it its own space. But this is what happens. This is why Noah's Ark has to happen. One last thing I want to put out here in verse 17. As the Most High is telling Noah to create the ark, he says this: "Behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on earth shall die." Again, so you've got some scholars that kind of right away or shoo off the idea of a global worldwide flood, and many of them consider themselves biblical scholars. The problem with that idea is what the Bible actually says. The Bible is pointing to a worldwide global flood. And global is actually a misnomer, because in the conception of the Hebrew Bible, it's not a globe, it's a terrain, right? That the Most High is going to flood the terrain. And when we get to Noah, we're going to see that the same waters that are above and the waters that are below, according to Genesis 1, is what the Most High rips. He unplugs the rakia, or the expanse. He unplugs the depths, and he floods the waters in both of those ways. Anyway, getting back to what we're talking about. So he's going to flood the world and destroy the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on earth shall die. Verse 18, I will establish my covenant with you, and you will come into the ark, you and your sons and your wives, and every living thing of all flesh you shall bring to of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Here's how I want to end this conversation. And the scriptures give us hints towards this all the time. What's about to happen in this flood narrative is the wrath of the Most High poured out onto all flesh because of the fall of the Watchers, because of the partnership of the fall of the Watchers with these humans. This whole thing has got to be scrubbed and done away with, and he's going to do something extremely dramatic. Namely, he's going to send the earth back into its uncreated state, right? Remember, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, that is the waters, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, right? So in other words, the uncreated state of the world, according to Genesis 1, was a watery chaos, right? Go back and check my math if I'm wrong there. Genesis 1, the uncreated state of the world is a watery chaos. And what God is saying is, I'm going to send it back to a watery chaos. This is the wrath of God. The wrath of God is the exact inverse of the creation of God. And this is the pattern that the Most High wants to show us, right? How God creates, the inverse is how he destroys. So we shouldn't be surprised when we should be able to predict and understand, according to the patterns, how the Most High is doing things. This is his instruction, his Torah. This is his self-revelation. He's trying to help us to see how he does things in these patterns. What we should note, though, is that God preserves the created order, that he's going to put a family into an ark with some animals, thus maintaining the created order. And they are going to, as the rest of the world floods, they are going to be in the ark with him. So what am I trying to say? This is the first place, this is the first pattern where we see wrath and rescue together. Those things go together. Wrath and rescue go together. Wrath and rescue go together. This is the first place that we see that. I'm trying to emphasize this because we're going to see it a whole bunch of other places. It is the baby Moses, Moshe, which means through the waters, that gets put in a little ark, a little basket. He goes through the waters of the Nile, and he ends up in Pharaoh's house. And it's through that baby that the wrath of Yah comes on that pagan society of Egypt. But the Israelites are saved out of it. It is a redo of what's happening here in Noah's Ark. And yeah, so wrath and rescue go together. This also means that if we find ourselves, which we do currently, we find ourselves with a world that is spiraling into chaos. If you just open your eyes, if you go on Twitter just for a half a second, you see our world is spiraling into chaos. Violence with North Korea, North Korea threatening violence to South Korea, China threatening to take over Taiwan, Israel and the genocide in Hamas, in Palestine, so on and so forth, et cetera, et cetera. Shutting down shipping containers in the Red Sea, Ukraine and Russia. What have I missed? Iran, The Houthis, over and over and over again. The whole world is spiraling into chaos. Not to mention Venezuela and what's happening there. All over the world is spiraling into chaos, and it looks like we're headed towards chaos. Tohu wa vohu, formless and void, wild wilderness. And this is the pattern of how the Most High pours out his wrath. But wrath and rescue always go together. So when we see, actually, let's go to Yahushua's words, and when we see great wrath and great uh, what do you call it, chaos descending on the world and the world being thrown into this thing, and even governmental bodies talking about a great reset and all these crazy things, pandemics happening and plagues and wars and rumors of war. When we see all of these things happen, we shouldn't be surprised. In fact, let's look at the words of Yahusha in Luke 21. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know then know that its desolation has come near. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So wherever Judea is, there should be mountains. And let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women that are pregnant, um, and those who are nursing infant in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. So he's talking about the Judeans. This happens in 70 AD. The Romans surround Judea, according to many historians, but including Roman historians like Tacitus and Judean historians like Josephus. Rome surrounds Judea. Judea falls in 70 AD, and this is the beginning of wrath, of great wrath and vengeance to fulfill all that is written against this people. This is not talking about the church. This is talking about the Israelites, the Judeans. There is no church at this point. It's just Yahusha and his followers. And Acts chapter 2 hasn't even happened yet, and then Acts the rest of Acts, there hasn't been any Gentiles added into this thing yet. Like none of that stuff has happened yet. So what we're talking about is specifically a wrath against quote unquote this people, that is the Judeans. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive, slaves among the nations, plural. And Jerusalem will be trampled down underfoot by the Gentiles. So this is how we know that it's not talking about the quote unquote church made of Jews and Gentiles, because whoever this people is, the Judeans, are going to be trampled down underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And there will be, so fast forward. So this has already happened, right? 70 AD. It was the start of this great tribulation, and all these crazy things that have happened. The Israelites were led into captivity in all the world. Go back and do the history. Verse 25. And there will be signs in the sun and the moon and stars, and on the earth distress and nations of perplexity because of the roaring of the seas and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding for what is coming on the world. For the power of the heavens will be shaken, and then you will see the Son of Man coming in cloud with power and great glory. Now, when you see these things begin to take place, straighten up, raise your head, because your redemption is drawing near. So, what is Yahushua saying? He's saying, yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff that's going to happen. First, he predicted what happened in 70 AD, and that happened a long time ago, as we know. And then he says then he fast forwards and he says everything's going to get dislodged. Anything that could be dislodged gets dislodged. The sea's going to start roaring. The sun and moon and stars are going to happen. The powers of the heavens are going to be shaken. And as you see the world descending into utter chaos, straighten up your back. Don't be scared. Nothing to be scared of. Straighten up your back. Raise your head, especially if you are a Judean who's gone through this tribulation, especially if you are a Judean who puts your faith and trust on Yahusha, the Messiah. Straighten your back. Raise your head, because your redemption is drawing near. Genesis chapter 6. We should not be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised at the words of Yahusha in Luke 21 if we get a good understanding of what's happening in Genesis chapter 6. And what's happening in Genesis chapter 6 is way more complicated than just some human leaders, uh, you know, uh, being rude and taking women, and it's way deeper than that. What we got is a rebellion in the heavens. There's a rebellion on earth because of Nahash, the serpent. Now there's a rebellion from the heavens to the earth with a legion of these fallen angels. And we're going to look at that more clearly in the book of Enoch to get an understanding of what they taught, what their motivation was, and what the implications of that was. But all in all, nothing to be afraid of. And in fact, it actually makes sense of our world. If we can begin to conceptualize these things, if we can begin to wrap our heads around what's going on here, we shouldn't be surprised that great wrath is coming upon the world. And there is great wrath coming. But at the same time, we should straighten our backs, lift up our eyes, because that means that the Most High is providing an ark one way or another. So again, this is my name is John. This is Melanated Truth. This is just another Torah talk. Please like, comment, and subscribe, especially if you've gotten this far in the video. Want to thank you for spending some time, and again, open to whatever discussions. You can email me or you can leave comments down below, so long as they're respectful, and we can talk these things out. Romans 15 verse 13, as always, this is meant to be to spur us on to loving good deeds according to Hebrews chapter 10. So I just pray, may the God, the Elohim, may the God of hope, the Elohim of hope, fill you with joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. These things might seem crazy to us, but he's got all these things under control. And nothing that's happening right now is much different than anything that's happened before. And just as the Most High is able to to destroy the wicked and preserve the righteous, and he always has through the epics and the annals of history, so now he's doing the same thing. Straighten your back, lift up your eyes, for our redemption draws nigh. May the Most High bless you and keep you.